Hello and welcome back to Rey's Gaming and some title update 1 talk. With the release of Arch-Tempered Rey Dau days away, we want to talk about what we can expect from this new version. And to do that, we're going to look back at the history of the AT releases to see what we might learn. You see, Tempered Monsters and Arch-Tempered were also concepts back in World, but not something in Rise. But in Wilds compared to the World version, they are more built in from the start and have more to them in general, with the new visuals for the scars, those being literal targets you can break for a special wound, which also rewards special rewards for doing so. Could Arch-Tempered push the mechanics even further in another Wilds unique way? We have also already seen that Tempered Mizu is essentially Soul Seer, so they could do some really interesting things with AT monsters. Now looking back, the quality of Arch-Tempered versions of monsters were certainly all over the place. Some of them had minimal changes, like the across-the-board damage and health increases, while other AT versions had new movesets, supers, improving the fight in many different aspects. The thing is, back then it was a kind of controversial topic, especially during World rather than Iceborne, since there were lots of ups and downs. We begin with our first AT monster, Kirin, which was certainly an awkward start for the system. It did increase the health and damage as they all do, and yet the burst was pretty scary on this one, but those mechanical changes that did come in were so subtle. Stuff like the lightning strikes happening all at once rather than one by one, or say in multiplayer, the strikes on a player location, it would affect everyone in the zone once, kind of individually, on top of just a thing we'll see across 18 monsters as a whole, a kind of reduction to ranged attacks. But funnily, if you were solo, you'd basically see no changes. It was overly subtle for this first showing. So a bit of a disappointment. People were expecting an entirely new version of a monster, like a G rank or master rank version, and this was just like a slightly tankier, more damaging version. With the introduction of AT monsters though, this introduced the Gamma armor sets, which are going to happen in Wilds 2 like we've seen for Rey, with different visuals to the base set, but nothing too crazy for the armor skills in this case. It had full thunder attack, blight res, free element, it was fine, but a pretty tame start to a cool system overall. Let's see how it progressed. Next came AT Vaal Hazak, another Elder which importantly followed up just weeks after AT Kirin. It wasn't quite as scary as the one-shot potential of AT Kirin, but it definitely had more health, and with that, constant chipping damage from this monster's aura. You'd need a proper setup to sustain you or a proper counter for it, so it wasn't too invasive. It's interesting to think that Kirin made you run protection against the whole one-shot, but then Vaal Hazak was forcing you to deal with that war of attrition. So running the older Fluvia resistance all the way to level 3 to prevent the build-up was certainly a game changer for this fight and kind of forced you to do so. They also changed the fight location slightly, forcing you to fight in tougher areas, especially with how they raised the acid levels in the last area. There were also subtle changes like the size of the monster, or when the belly slam happened, it dealt wind pressure instead of just normal knockback. They made the beam attack a bit bigger and made it slightly faster for a wind up, and again an anti-range aura, which could be helped by breaking its chest at the time, something that certainly would have helped. For the armor set, we had another Gamma set. This one was a bit more relevant. It featured recovery up and recovery speed, which were both useful, as well as good dragon attack and a bit of peak performance. Overall, the recovery stuff was actually very nice for this fight in specific, so the fight did change a couple things. You kind of needed to prepare a little bit for this fight, and then after that, nothing too scary. So another okay option. Next, things got a bit more interesting. A few weeks later, we had AT Teostra, with finally a new move. ATTO had a move for melee distance, a kind of AoE shotgun blast around the head, these bursts of fire, which was actually quite hard to deal with compared to the usual familiar moveset, where yeah, you'd stay at the head and deal great damage. Suddenly, that area is no longer remotely safe as much as it used to be, dealing with the medium and wider, longer range blast powder explosions at the same time. On top of that, you had the increased health and the increased damage, which were felt more here, because this was a monster with quicker combos and faster attacks, which meant that damage increase was scary. You could actually get comboed. Further, the damage was scary for fire in particular, because while you were able to build up flat defense with better gear in the game at the time, element defense wasn't going up, so the element attacks in this fight were really scary alongside the combos. And then the best DPS spot, the head, is now a really dangerous spot. So it was a reasonably intense update compared to other AT monsters with at least one move update. The first hit for this system. In regards to the new armor set, latent power, one weakness exploit on it, it was a bit awkward. Though there was some good crit eye on it, good for the helmet and gloves in specific slots. So overall, some use. This is the kind of thing that I'm hoping is a baseline for Rey Dau, at very least a piece or two that could work into the meta, but not a total power creep for gear. Next month after that, hell hit world with what was probably the most disliked fight in the game overall. Arch-tempered Kushala, the frame rate killer, but not a fun fight either. It's like they designed the fight to be a waste of time, not to challenge you. Kushala in World was always managed by your ability to just flash pod the guy out of the air. Well, AT versions of monsters removed that because now they just kind of flinch. So in the case of Kushala, it did not bring him out of the air, which was pretty miserable for any melee fight. There were other stuff to consider like wind pressure and the constant tornadoes tanking your frame rate, while you spend ages slapping at these dangling claws and tail. Who cared that they increased the damage and health? If you could barely hit the guy, that's a massive increase to the time you're fighting him. So like I said, the fight that I enjoyed the least in World overall, just a literal time waster. I'm sure they learned a lot from this though. Say the only monster that hangs in the air all the time in Wilds, that's Hirabami, and they were careful to make sure that that tail dangles low enough from melee the whole fight. So I'm not expecting AT Kushala nightmares again, but in regards to the armor set, it features handicraft, ice attack, focus, evade window, and evade extender, which were all decent in their own right. Nothing meta defining or incredible. So AT Kushala was the lowest point for the system. Moving forward a full month later, we had the next AT release, which was AT Lunastra. The initial reaction was disappointing, which was a shame because it's not like it was a bad update, it's just the game needed something fresh and challenging at the time, and this just wasn't that. Sure, harder as a fight because, you know, it was one of the harder monsters at the time, and you had more health and damage on it now. But if you fought Lunastra a good amount pre-AT version, which is what everyone was doing at the time, you'd feel very comfortable with this fight, and it wouldn't feel that different. It was emphasized by the ongoing conversation at the time about the tempered and arch-tempered system not really hitting right as kind of filler. And this was off the back of Kushala Rai, so the low point for the system. And a big complaint was kind of like, okay, we're fighting Elder Dragons all the time, could you instead give AT versions to the monsters that we want to fight that we don't ever fight for any reason? You know, your tier 2 monsters, like we have in Wilds right now. All the Guardians, Zuwu. I want a reason to fight those and make them challenging. But yeah, I really hope that they learned from Lunastra and how that was received kind of poorly at the time, that the choice of the AT monster should matter. Now, something much crazier and, well, interesting was the arch-tempered release of Zora, which, hey, was not the best monster hunter fight in the game, but a spectacle to be remembered, just not farmed and fought regularly. This AT version actually changed things, and that was largely due to the 25-minute timer it forced you on. So, you had to execute the different parts as fast as you could. It meant you had to maximize your DPS at the crystals, maybe you ran part breaker for the crystals or artillery for the cannon section, but this was all countered by the mini Nergigante encounter on Zora's back, which you have to actually repel now. It's not just a time and he leaves, which means you have to fight him properly in a speedrun environment. So if you're running skills like artillery and part breaker, you'd actually lose out on your maximum DPS against Nergi. You needed to get rid of Nergi to push to the barrier phase, so it was a kind of counterbalance. After that, you had the final barrier phase where you had to maximize the cannon usage, trying to get the 2 ticks out of Dragonator, maximizing the NPCs transporting the shots. So it took this spectacle fight that essentially had no stakes to one that required thought, effort, and timing. And if you were doing this in multiplayer, people with different roles, all while you race against the clock. So this was a big success for the AT system in general, one that did more than just add damage and health. Now, as far as the armor at the time, it had great skills like crit eye, and also a set bonus for critical status, which opened up some fun builds. So on that note, maybe the new set bonuses of the Gamma sets could be a way for them to introduce new skills or playstyles, or help out an aspect of damage. Like say, Element could do with a boost of some kind for certain weapons in particular. AT set bonuses could be a way for them to do that. But off the back of a decent update for Zora, we got something amazing. Arch-tempered Xeno'Jiiva, which was a massive success for the system and showed the reason for it. Not only does the fight instantly start in phase 2 now, where things start to get interesting in the first place, they gave him multiple new moves instead of just subtle stuff. The subtle stuff was still there, like the increased fire floor, which was certainly dangerous with this increased damage, but the new moves where he's sweeping the arena with a massive beam attack, or the arena-wide massive spreading earthquakes, the shockwaves coming from the tail slams now, and in general the much more damage of it all to add a pressure which was barely there in the original fight. This was like the low rank Zora to high rank Zora as we've experienced recently in Wilds. And for the set, well, the armor set had decent decoration slots and a useful set bonus for razor sharp and spare slot, crit boost, and good setups for like the waist and the legs in particular. The problem at the time was how much this was all power crept by title update content and gear. There was just better options. If this set came nearer to launch, that would have been amazing. So that's another thing to think about for Wilds. Useful meta-relevant sets with the update of new gear to challenge what's currently meta at least a little bit. When it comes too late, when title updates hit and crazy power creep gear comes in, it overshadows these things entirely. So the timing of gamma sets is also important. Moving on, we had Arch-Tempered Kulve Taroth, a unique fight as part of a siege with an actual monster fight at the end. And while this AT version didn't add a ton to the fight most of the way, it did make her final section with the frenzy mode very scary, where she's moving faster. She does have a couple new moves like the cone fire sweep or the paw slam blowing up fire and head slam. Not significantly harder, but the frenzy mode being certainly scary, which is reasonable. It did add something very special to the game at the time though, an entirely new set of Kulve weapons, the incandescent weapons that RNG spawn after going through the fight and trying to maximize the part breaking and breaking the horns and all that stuff. These weapons had great stats, new visuals, and was a meta-relevant grind at the time, which was a big deal for the AT roster that hadn't done something like that before. Technically, it was 95 new weapons, but you know, the Kulve Taroth system was a lot of garbage and then some good ones, and you were hoping to get through the bad ones to get the good ones. Still, they were cool though as weapons, featuring crit status and crit element, which offered much more of an element meta at the time. Though, having said that, the armor set, the gamma set, wasn't hugely impactful. There were a couple pieces you could argue for, like the gloves and especially the waist, thanks to crit boost and weakness exploit, but a lot of this was overshadowed by this stage of the game, most people having the decorations they needed to get these things anyway. Though, if you joined into World late, these armor sets would have been amazing for you actually, so that's something to consider. But I do not expect to see a crazy weapon system like this for something like the Apexes, let alone Rey Dau, because AT monsters don't introduce new weapons on average. But that brings us to the last Arch-Tempered update for base world, AT Nerf, the flagship monster of the game. With a massive increase to health and damage, this one was really scary. With the most time between launch and this AT version, you can imagine that the experience and the feedback of the system played a huge role in this one being a slam dunk success. It started in a new zone compared to normal, progressed to zones you wouldn't normally go to otherwise, there were scripted dive bomb sections, and a totally new attack that was really terrifying. It came out super fast as this back up slam attack that caused many carts at the time. This attack was so scary that they brought it straight over to the Ruiner version in Master Rank later in Iceborne. So that's a pretty big deal, an Arch-Tempered move being brought forward to a different version of the monster because it was received so well. We're seeing the reverse of that in Wilds, where we're seeing Soulseer aspects in the tempered version of Mizu, which is kind of interesting to think about. Another aspect of this fight though was the health increase, how it actually increased the health of the spikes, which you needed to break before they hardened, which basically became incredibly hard to do in this harder version of the fight, so that resulted in a harder to control Nerf, not flinching and controlling it at all. That reminds me of the incoming wound resistance concept that we're going to see in the May update actually. So yeah, they gave him a cool new move, a scripted dive bomb and kind of more scary dive bombs in general, mixed up the combos, which was very tough to deal with, and made his main mechanic, the spikes, way harder to manage. I will also mention the armor set, which came very late into World's life, obviously. It was good, but it wasn't good enough to fully challenge the meta sets around Behemoth at the time. Great slots, and a big pile of things like attack boost, which was awesome on the legs, or relevant skills across the set. Great again if you're joining late, but didn't truly challenge the meta at the time. But what about the expansion? Iceborne, it's just Nami and Velk, so let's take a look. Starting with the first one, Arch-Tempered Nami, this was a bit of a jump. Nothing felt extremely different in the moveset, but it's the way that she worked was noticeably different. Like yeah, she progressed in different areas than the normal version, but say the visuals. She starts with this crackling energy, which actually meant she's charged up with that thunder immediately and can charge up sooner. This means this mix of water and thunder monster was doing that immediately rather than building up to it, which was certainly a scary concept. She would also enrage quicker, punishing the clutch claw usage at the wrong time. This was because of more often use of the super attack, which was also a bit bigger. In general, she also seemed to have some sort of resistance to the clutch claw mechanic, kind of like the AT monsters of World, having flash pod resistance. They made her wings immune to range damage, which greatly reduced the pierce gameplay for this monster. So it wasn't super overhauled, but there was enough there to change how the fight progressed. The Gamma set itself was reasonable, great for stamina sets, providing full stamina surge, almost full constitution on individual pieces. So if you were desperate for stamina like bow or dual blades, this was actually awesome. And this is the kind of thing that would hit well for our arch-tempered apexes. Things that are particularly useful for specific playstyles or weapons in particular, just really heavy stats and high-level skills. So while this arch-tempered Namielle was a bit disappointing compared to Xeno and Nergi, it definitely was one of the better AT monsters. But that brings us to the last one. Arch-tempered Velkhana, the last AT monster that came even around the time of Fatalis. Thankfully, this was an incredible update. It had a new roster of moves, an entire new super move, the pace of the fight was just so much faster, she was so much more aggressive. And like I said, this came around the time of Fatalis, so this needed to be a real challenge to compete with that, and it kind of did it. She was just on top of you with the air slams and the accurate beam blasts. You couldn't really create space. She would also delay her ice explosions, spread them out in circular waves. The tail stab and spin was just a nightmare to deal with as a fast combo. This kind of felt like Velkhana in her full form. Everything was on 2 times speed, and the result was the best version of the fight, which is a big success for the AT system, ending on a high. It wasn't as memorable or as intense as Fatalis, but it took a monster that was, that was fine, to something that was seriously awesome and actually memorable, and that's what I hope we see for our arch-tempered apexes in Wilds. On the other hand, it was competing in terms of gear with the meta set that was Fatalis equipment, and it definitely didn't take that throne, but it did actually work in its own niche. It had a pile of solid skills on the set, crit element and frostcraft as the set bonuses. The individual pieces had great high level stuff like 3 levels of coalescence on just the helm. Decoration slots were good too. So it definitely tried to compete with the Fatalis stuff, but it was the frostcraft set bonus on an actual good set now compared to the normal Velk set that meant any build or weapon that wanted to lean into frostcraft was very happy in this set. It served that alternative build purpose. But that brings us to the end of this look back then. This tells us that there certainly were lows with the system, just some terrible updates to monsters that made them worse, like Kushella being the biggest offender there. But on average, it was just kind of alright. The fight didn't add a lot and didn't challenge the meta enough. The best of it, though, that really hit. The best version of Nergigante, the best version of the Velkhana fight. It actually made Zora somewhat engaging, which is a feat in itself, and it made Xeno the proper final boss for World that it should have been. So while it had its highs and lows, it overall was a positive thing for World, I think. And hopefully that experience and the feedback from that system can really help Wilds. Just maybe, Rey Dau's AT version will have significant moveset changes beyond just more damage and health. We've already seen a dangerous combo in the trailer where it blasts underneath itself and then from the air, which is definitely going to catch people out. Hopefully that armor set can provide a new unique skill that's relevant to some builds, or at least a piece or two that works in your average meta. Hopefully they take the already awesome Rey Dau and just kind of speed up the fight like they did with Velkhana to make something really satisfying as a challenge. They've been able to do it before, even if they did have some bumps in the road before. Time will tell though, but thankfully we don't have long to wait. For now then, I've been Hollow, you've been you, and thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.